There is a food that was buried with mummies to feed them in the afterlife. A root so nutritious it sustained entire civilizations for 6,000 years. And today, agriculture departments call it one of the worst weeds on the planet. Companies make herbicides just to kill it. Official bulletins tell farmers to destroy it the moment they see it. There are businesses built entirely around getting rid of this plant, and in some countries, if you plant it on purpose, you're breaking the law. But acre for acre, it grows more food than almost anything we farm on purpose. Drought doesn't kill it. It doesn't need fertilizer, it doesn't need pesticides, and it doesn't need a single machine to put it in the ground. That's the reason it had to disappear. So this is the story about a superfood that got labeled as a weed. And there's a real chance this thing is growing somewhere near you right now, and you can go find it yourself. Look for a stem with 3 flat sides, almost like a tiny triangle, poking up out of grass, a garden bed, even a crack in the pavement. Pull on it and you'll feel small, hard knots along the roots underneath. Most people who've come across this plant have yanked it out and thrown it away without a second look. Old-timers had a saying for it: sedges have edges. Run your fingers down the stem and you'll feel that ridge right away. It likes wet ground, the edge of a ditch, a garden bed that never quite dries out, that one soft, damp patch in a lawn that stays wet long after everything around it has dried up. The leaves are narrow and low to the ground, almost like grass. But look closer, and you'll notice they grow in 3 rows around the stem instead of 2. By late summer, it sends up a cluster of small golden brown flower heads, and that's usually the point where people just call it a weed and move on. Pull one up, though, and underground you'll find a tangle of thin roots strung with little knots, sometimes 75 of them off a single plant, each one about the size of a marble. Break one open and it smells sweet, almost like coconut mixed with almond. That smell is exactly why people have been digging these up and eating them for longer than any crop we grow on purpose today. You might know it under a different name where you're from. In stores, it's usually sold as tiger nuts. But the name that survived 6,000 years, the name they still use in Spain today, is chufa. The people who buried this plant with their pharaohs knew 5 things about it that the modern world has completely forgotten. 4 of those things explain where this plant came from and why it disappeared off your plate. The 5th one matters more than all the others combined. It's the difference between a healthy handful of these roots and something that can genuinely make you sick. And I'm not letting you walk away from this video without it. My name is Toby Woodruff, and I come from a long line of people who made their living knowing exactly which plants would feed you and which ones would put you in the ground. My great-aunt Opal raised me. She'd walk me along these ridges and make me press and label every single plant into a book before I was ever allowed to put one in my mouth. She had one rule, and she repeated it so many times it just became part of how I think. You don't get to know what a plant feeds you until you know what it can do to you if you get it wrong. That's exactly why I'm the right person to walk you through this. And if you want to know more about all the free food and medicine growing around you, I put everything into one complete guide. Scan the QR code, click the link in the description, or visit freefoodandmedicine.com to get your copy. Every plant you need to know, how to identify it, and how to heal yourself and eat for free. Now down along the Nile, near a place called Wadi Kubaniya, archaeologists found wild tubers of this exact plant that carbon dating puts it somewhere around 16,000 years old, roughly 8,000 years before anybody on Earth had figured out farming. People were walking out into wild marshes during the last ice age, digging these things out of the mud with their bare hands, eating them raw because there was nothing else around that packed that much energy. By around 5,000 years before the pyramids, chufa had become one of the most important crops in Egypt, ranked right behind wheat and barley, one of the foundations an entire civilization was built on. In the tomb of a man named Rekhmire, a vizier who served under Pharaoh Thutmose III, there are wall paintings that show workers measuring out chufa tubers by the basket, grinding them down with long stone pestles, and mixing that paste with honey to shape into tall pointed cakes. These were offerings made by royal decree baked fresh for every major feast held in honor of the god Amun. Greek and Roman writers described this plant too, boiled down in beer and traded up and down their empires. For thousands of years, on 3 different continents, this plant was simply what people ate. You can dry it out in the sun, and once it is properly dried, it keeps for years without spoiling, without refrigeration, and without a single chemical touching it, which meant families could dig it up in the fall and still have food in storage no matter what winter did to everything else they were growing. That is 6,000 years of a civilization depending on this one tuber to survive, long before anybody ever called it a health food trend. This tuber runs close to 10% protein, and unlike most things that grow out of the ground, it carries every single essential amino acid your body needs, which puts it a lot closer to meat or eggs than to your average vegetable. Most of the fat in it is the same healthy unsaturated fat you would get from olive oil, and the oil content runs high enough that researchers have looked seriously at using it for biodiesel. Most of the carbohydrate in chufa is what is called resistant starch, and that matters because resistant starch feeds the good bacteria in your gut instead of spiking your blood sugar the way regular starch does. It carries roughly double the starch of a potato, but without the same blood sugar crash afterward, and the fiber content runs several times higher than what you would get out of most everyday grains. It also carries real calcium, magnesium, iron, and potassium, and the whole thing is naturally free of both gluten and dairy. You can eat the tubers raw, roast them, grind them into flour, or soak them and blend them into a milk. A civilization built its entire calendar around digging this thing up because it was one of the most complete foods they had access to. Now, there is one very specific kind of ground this plant grows best in today, and I am going to come back to that in a few minutes, because the reason it likes that particular ground is going to matter a lot more than you think once we get to that 5th piece. So here is the part that should stop you cold. The wild form of this exact plant, the one that fed the pharaohs, is officially classified today as one of the worst weeds on the entire planet. That classification comes out of a book published in 1977 by a group of researchers named Holm, Plucknett, Poncho, and Herberger, called The World's Worst Weeds, and it is still the standard reference that agricultural extension offices use right now, this year, when they tell farmers how to deal with it. County extension offices publish bulletins on it, universities run research programs built around killing it, and chemical companies have created entire product lines whose only purpose is destroying it. In several states, it is officially listed as a noxious weed, which means landowners are legally required to control it wherever it shows up. And in some places, planting it on purpose can put you in direct violation of state agricultural law. If you look up why it earned that reputation, the official answer is always the same. It spreads through underground tubers that keep growing back even after everything above the ground gets killed, and once it gets established in a field, it is nearly impossible to get rid of for good. Read that answer again, because that is actually a description of a plant that is exceptionally good at feeding people whether anybody helps it or not. Ask yourself why a plant surviving completely on its own, with no fertilizer and no irrigation, gets treated as an emergency by the same industry that spends billions of dollars every year just keeping wheat and corn alive. The honest answer is that nobody can patent chufa. It has been grown by ordinary people for 6,000 years, and that means nobody owns it. Nobody can sell you a proprietary seed for it, or a fertilizer it actually needs, because a farmer who grows it can just save his own tubers and replant them forever, without ever buying from anybody again. There is no room in that plant for an industry to make money off of you. Compare that to wheat, corn, and soybeans, the crops our food system actually got built around. Every one of them needs a farmer buying new seed, new fertilizer, and new chemicals, year after year. This is simpler and a little sadder than a conspiracy, friend. Anything nobody can bill you for eventually just stops getting taught. So they gave it the only label that made sense to them. They called it a weed, and they built an entire arsenal of chemicals whose only job is putting it back in the ground. Somewhere in that process, you got trained to look at a plant like this, growing wild in your own yard, and see a problem instead of a pantry. If you want to know what else got buried this same way, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because that is exactly what this channel exists to dig up. The food and the medicine your own family used to know before somebody figured out there was more money in you forgetting it. Now, not every patch of this plant is actually worth digging up, and this is where I promised I would come back to that ground I mentioned earlier. If you ever go looking for chufa yourself, the ground it is growing in matters just as much as the plant does. The best ground is high, clean soil that has never been sprayed, something like an old garden bed or a stretch of untouched pasture where nothing has ever been dumped or treated. The next best ground is a ditch bank or a low wet spot that only ever collects rainwater, with nothing running off a treated field above it. After that, you get into riskier ground, the edge of a farm field, right along the tree line, close enough to catch drift from whatever gets sprayed on the crop next to it. Below that is any patch growing along a road shoulder or the edge of a parking lot, soaking up whatever runs off the pavement. And at the very bottom of that list sits the exact ground this plant is most likely to actually be found on today, the margins of commercial cropland, because that is precisely the ground where farmers are spraying hardest to kill it. That is the piece I told you I would come back to. The very success that got this plant classified as a menace also pushed it onto the most contaminated ground there is. The plant that once fed pharaohs now grows best in exactly the ground where people are working hardest to kill it. I learned to respect that the hard way. When I was about 11 years old, Opal sent me down to the creek to dig chufa, and I came back with a whole sack of it, proud of myself, and she took one look at where I had been digging, right along the edge of a hayfield, and made me dump every single tuber back in the ditch. She never even raised her voice. She just asked me if I had any plans to eat the spray along with the plant, because that hayfield had been sprayed twice already that summer. I never forgot that, and it is exactly why the next part matters just as much as knowing where to dig. Finding a safe patch is only half of staying safe with this plant. What you do with it after you pull it out of the ground is the other half, and that half is where people actually get hurt. Here is the piece the people who filled those tombs never once got wrong, the exact same piece that a lot of the tiger nuts sitting in bags on store shelves right now get wrong constantly. This plant grows underground, in wet soil, which means every tuber comes out of the ground damp, and damp is the one condition a very specific kind of mold absolutely loves. If a tuber does not get dried out fast enough or gets stored somewhere humid, that mold moves in, and unlike ordinary mold, it does not just spoil the tuber. It produces a toxin that builds up inside the tuber itself, one your eyes cannot always see and your nose does not always catch, and it is one of the most dangerous natural toxins in the human food supply, linked directly to liver damage over time. Researchers testing tiger nuts sold in markets across Nigeria and Ghana have found this exact toxin sitting inside tubers that looked completely normal from the outside. Researchers in Spain, in the very same region that has been making horchata out of chufa for 700 years, have found the same problem shows up specifically when drying gets delayed or storage gets too humid. The toxin is called aflatoxin, and the mold that produces it is called Aspergillus flavus. And I am telling you both of those names right now because I want you to remember them every single time you pick up a bag of tiger nuts or dig a batch of your own out of the ground. The people burying tubers in those Egyptian tombs 6,000 years ago needed those tubers to actually last, sealed inside a tomb, for eternity. And the only way to make that happen was to dry them completely, out in the open desert air, for weeks, until there was so little moisture left inside them that nothing could grow. That was food safety, worked out through trial and error, thousands of years before anybody had a microscope to explain why it actually worked. When you buy tiger nuts today, or dig your own, that same drying step is the one thing you absolutely have to get right. Smell them before you eat one. Properly dried chufa smells sweet and a little nutty, and anything musty or sour means the mold already got there first. Check how they feel too. A tuber that dried correctly feels hard and light, almost like a small stone, and if it feels soft, leathery, or even slightly damp, That leftover moisture is exactly the door this mold walks through. If you are drying your own, spread them in a single layer somewhere warm and dry with good airflow, not piled in a bucket or sealed in a bag, and leave them for 2 to 3 weeks, until they go from soft and pale to hard and darker on the outside. Skip that step, rush it, or store them somewhere damp afterward, and you have taken the exact food that helped a civilization survive for 6,000 years and turned it into something that can genuinely hurt you. Get that one step right, the same way the people building those tombs got it right, and you have got yourself a food that will keep for years, without a refrigerator, without a single chemical, and without ever going bad on you. So let me hand you all 5 pieces one more time together. You can spot this plant anywhere by its triangular stem and its 3 ranked leaves, growing in the wet, low ground that everybody else walks right past and calls a weed patch. It is called chufa, sold today as tiger nuts, and it fed people for 16,000 years before anybody ever called it a crop on purpose. It carries real protein, healthy fat, resistant starch, and more fiber than most of what is already sitting in your pantry, and it earned a place in Egyptian tombs because it could be dried and stored for years without ever spoiling. It got classified as one of the worst weeds on the planet the moment industrial farming realized nobody could patent it or sell you anything to grow it, and that same classification pushed it onto the most contaminated ground available, right along the edges of the fields where they spray hardest to kill it, which is exactly why where you dig matters as much as it does. And the piece that ties every bit of that together is the piece the tomb builders never skipped. You dry it out completely, in the open air, for weeks, until it goes hard and light, because a damp tuber grows a mold that produces one of the most dangerous toxins in the entire human food supply. And that single step is the whole difference between the food that helped build a civilization and something that can genuinely make you sick. None of this was ever really about a tuber, friend. It was about noticing how easily something gets erased the moment nobody can profit from it, and about learning to look at a weed patch the same way your ancestors did, as a pantry instead of a problem. You do not have to go dig up a field this weekend to get started either. Go to a health food store, buy a small bag of raw tiger nuts, and before you eat a single one, smell them and check that they feel hard and dry all the way through. Soak a small handful in water overnight, let them swell back up, and eat them the same way people have been eating them for 16,000 years. That is your entry ticket, and once you have done it once, you are never going to look at a marshy ditch the same way again. Tell me down in the comments, had you ever heard of chufa before tonight, or did you only know it as tiger nuts off a store shelf? And if you have ever pulled this exact plant out of your own yard and thrown it straight in the trash without knowing what it actually was, I want to hear that story too, because you are far from the only one. Thank you all for watching. And if you want to know more about the free food and medicine growing all around you, I put everything into one complete guide. Every plant you need to know, how to identify it, and how to heal yourself and eat for free. Scan the QR or visit freefoodandmedicine.com to get your copy. I'll see you in the next video.